In 2017, there was a Taiwan army officer who became very famous after he walked across China from Guangzhou to Beijing over a period of 94 days. Colonel Yan Desheng was a retired officer from the Republic of China Taiwan Army. He was born in 1956 and graduated from the Army Officer School in the 1970s. Serving with distinction, he earned a lot of awards and earned the respect of the soldiers that he led. Colonel Yeo walked across China for 94 days from Guangzhou to Nanking and from Nanking to Beijing. The reason why he embarked on this journey was to retrace the steps of the Northern Expedition, which was the campaign launched by the Chinese nationalists to unite China in the 1920s and to pay respects to the Chinese soldiers who died in battle. In April 2017, Colonel Yeo and a small group of his supporters left Taiwan and traveled to mainland China. They arrived in Guangzhou. While in Guangzhou, Colonel Yeo and his supporters went to the old site of the Whampoa Military Academy, which is now a museum. The Whampoa Military Academy used to be this military school which trained the officers to lead the Northern Expedition, and it was set up by Sun Yat-sen. After paying respects to the monument there, on April 6, 2017 at 5 a.m., Colonel Yeo and his group officially began their journey setting out from Guangzhou. They left Guangzhou and marched northwards, covering 40 kilometers a day. The colonel and his group passed by many small Chinese towns and small Chinese villages during their journey. The colonel and his group openly carried the blue sky, white sun nationalist flag, and they talked to many curious mainland Chinese people. Sometimes the colonel will be wearing a historic Chinese nationalist army uniform as they were marching. And some of these mainland Chinese people were very curious and very interested and very sympathetic to the colonel's journey. And some of them even accompanied the colonel and joined his group, just like in that movie, Forrest Gump. Remember how in Forrest Gump, Tom Hanks was running across the United States and these people just began joining him in his run? Same thing happened in China. Colonel Yeo and his group was marching northwards from Guangzhou to Nanking and from Nanking to Beijing. And these Chinese people were very curious. They just joined them and they just all began walking northwards. On June 1st, 2017, the colonel and his group arrived in Nanking. The colonel first went to the Sun Yat-sen Mausoleum to pay respect to Sun Yat-sen. The colonel laid a wreath on the Sun Yat-sen statue there, and afterwards unfurled a flag of the Republic of China Military Academy. And the group began singing nationalist Chinese songs. On June 10th, 2017 at 2 p.m., Colonel Yeo arrived at his ancestral village. There, he performed traditional Chinese rituals to pay respects to his ancestors and honored his ancestors' spirits in heaven. On July 7th, 2017, which was the anniversary of the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the first battle between China and Japan during the Second Sino-Japanese War, the colonel, dressed in a historic Chinese nationalist army uniform, went to the Marco Polo Bridge and he paid respect to the soldiers that fought there, concluding his journey. The colonel went back to Taiwan afterwards and became somewhat of a celebrity, right? And many Chinese nationalists on Taiwan praised the colonel and his trip. In 2018, the Taiwan government, which was led by the Democratic Progressive Party and the Taiwan Independence Politicians, introduced a proposal to slash pensions for military veterans in Taiwan. This sparked massive outrage all across the island, and all these Taiwan army veterans and military veterans went out to the streets to protest. On March 5th, 2018, Colonel Yan Desheng, during one of these demonstrations, was killed after falling from the second floor of a building. The colonel was 62 years old. On the 22nd of March 2018, a massive commemoration event was held in Taiwan to pay respect for Colonel Yeo and his legacy. Ma Ying-jeou, the former leader of Taiwan, was in attendance. Wu Denyi, the chairman of the KMT, was in attendance. Hundreds of retired officials and veterans were in attendance, and thousands of Chinese people attended this event to recognize his contribution in the service of China. The Democratic Progressive Party and the politicians in Taiwan from the Taiwan Independence movement have no morals. They have no conscience. They're bullying old people. They're bullying old military veterans in Taiwan. These military veterans are like 60 years old, 70 years old, 80 years old, and they are getting their pensions cut by these pension reforms. And these politicians in Taiwan did not even consult with the veteran affairs groups. They did not even consult with the veteran advocacy groups. They just unilaterally decided to cut it one day. So these veterans in Taiwan have the right to be angry. They have the right to protest. They should be angry. A lot of rallies, a lot of demonstrations broke out all across Taiwan in the year 2018. All these military veterans got together to protest. Colonel Yo was not the only casualty of these protests. Other veterans also were injured and were killed during these protests. Another colonel, I believe, fell off a fence and he injured himself and died. And there was a third colonel who was retired, Colonel Chen, on April 25th, lost his fingers during one of these protests. Like, a struggle broke out between police and protesters. One of the police officers, for some reason, had a hydraulic shear, and Colonel Chen's fingers somehow ended up in those shears, and they got crushed, and he lost his fingers. Right? So what was the Democratic Progressive Party's response to all these demonstrations? What was the leaders, the president's response to all these protests? Well, Tsai Ing-wen, she came out in June, and she said that there should be no regrets about reforms. No regrets! You know what's funny? Colonel Yo and his group was treated better in mainland China, in communist China, than in Taiwan. Colonel Yo was in mainland China, walking from Guangzhou to Beijing, flying a ROC flag, wearing the old nationalist army uniform, and he was treated much better by the communists than in his own Taiwan, by the Democratic Progressive Party. Ain't that something?